Good evening. We start, of course, here in Sandton tonight, the site of the Judicial Service Commission interviews into the 4 candidates for the position of Chief Justice. Today, the term of the President of the Supreme Court of Appeal, Judge Mandisa. The questions ranging around her gender, her identity, her life story, her own personal history within the judiciary and in the legal profession. And then, of course, that involves a story about our country. But it also then brings in questions around corruption and how she believes judges should conduct themselves on the bench. Joined now by Dan Mafora from the Council for the Advancement of the South African Constitution. Dan, good afternoon to you. Really do appreciate the time. A lot to get through. Firstly, the issue of gender, and again this point has been made on social media, on talk radio, by people sitting in the chair that you're sitting in now this afternoon. It seems to be unfair to ask a victim of prejudice, in this case a female judge, about how to deal with that prejudice. And yet again, that's how the Judicial Service Commission seems to have handled it.
Absolutely. So what we are seeing today is the discussion of gender carrying on from yesterday, but today from a different perspective. So a lot of the questions were focused around the challenges that women face as judges in the profession, and of course Judge Maya telling us about how she was the first judge to be pregnant and how they didn't know how to deal with her. But we are also seeing these kinds of accusations of how women judges or women lawyers are their own enemy and how they are the ones stifling transformation. And so it's a very interesting turn of events. I thought that the question of gender would not predominate the discussion as it has today, but that was a chunk of the questions that she received. Whether or not that was fair or unfair, I really can't tell, but certainly I think it is going to be a recurring theme throughout the week.
I mean, in a way, if my memory is correct, this was actually brought up. Was it Nosavuyo Mapisa-Nqakula who first brought it up yesterday? She is the Speaker of Parliament. She's here in the Judicial Service Commission. But the framing of the question, is South Africa ready for a female Chief Justice? I think it's provoked a lot of discussion, because that's not really the question in a way. I think the question could perhaps be better phrased, which would be, is it now more appropriate to have a female Chief Justice than a male Chief Justice? Is that how we want to run things? As I understand the way that judges are appointed, the JSC is supposed to take identity, it's supposed to take race and gender into consideration.
Absolutely. This question, of course, assumes that, men are the default. So when you start asking the question about whether or not South Africa is ready for a woman or a female Chief Justice, you are actually questioning the value that women bring to the profession. And I think that Justice Maya handled that well to say, when did we decide that men, were the right people to actually lead the judiciary? And so it is quite a strange question, and there seems to be like a kind of a lack of introspection on the part of the JSC for how they have handled or what they have contributed to the current state of affairs.
There was a new topic introduced towards near the end. Again, Julius Malema, Commissioner for the JSC from the Economic Freedom Party, Economic Freedom Fighters, listen to me, force representing Parliament here as one of the MPs. And he said, should we not have sort of corruption courts like we had World Cup courts in 2010? Judge Maya's response, and I'm going to praise this and summarize it, she said, well, that might be a good idea. Every right-thinking person should agree with that, but we don't have the money, and Treasury would come back and say we don't have the resources. Do you agree with that? I mean, we have a special tribunal which is kind of the same thing in a way.
Right. So I think that was a very good point for her to kind of throw it back to the minister and say, well, we can do it, but there's just no money. But of course the minister came back and said, it doesn't matter how many courts we create if we don't have investigators, if we don't have prosecutors who are actually skilled at these very complex and forensic matters, then we won't have prosecution and prosecutions, successful prosecutions for corruption. And I do think that it is something that is obviously been in the news, that the department is considering setting up new courts. That will ultimately depend on whether or not there is actually the money for that and the appetite on the part of the judiciary to set aside its own resources and contribute to that fund. But certainly that is also building up to, I think, Justice Zondo's interview on Friday, which should be quite interesting.
Well, I think shots have been fired already. I'm going to come to that. Isn't there a bigger question? Should we have a special corruption court Because corruption's well defined in our law, it's well defined in the Act, the courts have dealt with these cases before. Why would corruption be treated differently? And I can just imagine the arguments over rules. I can imagine the appeals to the Constitutional Court by people with very expensive lawyers, even if they tweet they've done nothing wrong. So what I'm pointing to is that, is it really, from a legal, philosophical, can I say the word properly, jurisprudential way, is it really the right thing to do?
It might actually be the right thing to do. The issue with the current system is, of course, as people have highlighted, that there are so many avenues to try and raise technicalities, legal, procedural steps that tend to delay matters until such a time that, it's been years since a case was first lodged in the High Court or an indictment was served, that at the time that the prosecution has to move forward, it's already too late. People no longer have the appetite and things like that. So having a specialized system with shorter avenue or with shorter timelines, new rules, specific rules to the kinds of prosecutions or the kinds of cases you want to run might actually be more beneficial than running through the current system as it is.
There was a fascinating little nugget that I thought President Meyer, I should say, dropped, which is where she said, she was asked a question by Malema, and I don't quite know where he's going, but we may find out tomorrow or Friday,
right,
where he asked a question about, would it be appropriate for a judge to meet with the president at a personal house and for us to be told that we can't be told what was actually going on there. And then she gave an example where she said, well, the former premier of the Free State used to live 10 minutes away from where I live. If I saw his cavalcade, I actually drove the other way. And I presume she's talking about Ace I mean, she's also making a comment about how judges should behave.
Absolutely. I think that Mr. Malema is building up to something. Obviously, this question was also put to Justice Madlanga yesterday, but you can see that this question has nothing to do with either of these candidates. But there is something going on. Perhaps he's trying to leave a trail, of crumbs for us to follow. But I did think it was a very interesting answer to say, well, I try to avoid that as much as I can. If I see my neighbor coming out, I run the other way, just so I can avoid, even the appearance of friendly relations between him and I in a capacity that is not official. And I thought that was very interesting. And of course, Mr. Malema made the point that you know of the meeting, but you don't know what the meeting was about. And I think that's the issue, is that it may not be improper if you disclose what was actually going on instead of kind of shrouding it in secrecy.
Dan Mafora, I really appreciate the time. I can't imagine you've had any sleep this week, and probably won't get some for some time to come, because we'll bug you again tomorrow. Dan Mafora is, of course, the research officer with the Council for the Advancement of the South African Constitution.